The wind howled like a wounded animal through the mountain passes, carrying with it sheets of snow that cut through the darkness like white knives. Thomas Blackfeather, known to the few souls brave enough to venture this far into Apache territory as Giant Apache, swung his axe down hard into the frozen log. The wood split with a crack that echoed off the canyon walls, momentarily drowning out the storm's fury. At 6 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulders broad as a barn door and hands that could snap a man's rifle in half, Thomas was a sight that made even the boldest frontiersman step aside. His Apache blood showed in his sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that held the wisdom of his ancestors, though his size came from somewhere else, perhaps from the mountain itself. Folks would whisper when they thought he couldn't hear. "Papa," the small voice barely carried over the wind, but Thomas heard it clear as a church bell. His daughter Sarah came stumbling through the snow, her tiny figure wrapped in the buffalo hide he'd traded for last autumn. At 6 years old, she was delicate as a prairie flower, with her mother's gentle features and eyes that sparkled like creek water in sunlight. "Someone's coming," she called out, pointing toward the narrow trail that led up from the valley below. "I heard footsteps. Papa, different from the animals." Thomas set down his axe and squinted into the swirling white. His hand moved instinctively to the Winchester propped against the woodpile. In these mountains, in weather like this, visitors meant trouble more often than not. The year was 1887, but the memories of raids and retaliations still ran fresh as blood in these parts. Through the veil of snow, a figure emerged, stumbling, falling, pushing forward with the desperate determination of someone who had nowhere else to go. It was a woman. That much was clear from her shape, though she was bundled in what looked like a man's coat 3 sizes too big. She fell to her knees just 20 yards from their cabin, and for a moment Thomas thought she might not get up again. But she did. Using her bare hands to push herself up from the snow, she struggled forward until she stood before them, swaying like a sapling in the wind. Ice crystals clung to her dark hair where it had escaped from beneath a worn bonnet. Her face was pale as fresh milk, save for the purple shadow of cold across her cheeks. "Please," she said, and her voice was hoarse as if she'd been calling out for hours. "Just for tonight. I can cook. I can work. Just for tonight." Sarah tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "She's cold. Papa, look at her hands." The woman's hands were indeed bare, red and raw from the cold. She tucked them under her arms, but not before Thomas noticed the bruising around her wrists, dark marks that had nothing to do with the weather. "Name," Thomas said. It wasn't quite a question, more a requirement. "Margaret," she answered, teeth chattering. "Margaret O'Brien. I can cook, mend, clean. I won't be any trouble. Just need shelter from the storm." Thomas had lived alone with Sarah for 3 years now, since the fever took his wife. He'd managed well enough. Apache men learned to care for themselves and their families. But Sarah had been asking more and more about why their home didn't smell like other homes, why their food didn't taste like the meals at the trading post. He'd caught her once trying to braid her own hair the way she'd seen the merchant's wife do it, her small fingers tangling in the dark strands until she cried with frustration. "One night," he said finally, "for the child." Margaret's legs gave out then, whether from relief or exhaustion. Thomas couldn't tell. He caught her before she hit the ground, surprised at how light she was beneath all those layers. Like a bird, he thought, hollow-boned and fragile. Sarah darted ahead, pushing open the heavy door of their cabin. "This way? We have a fire and everything." The cabin was sturdy, built with Thomas's own hands from logs he'd cut and stones he'd hauled up from the creek bed. It was one large room with a sleeping loft above, furnished simply but well-maintained. The fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn furniture. Margaret stood just inside the doorway, water pooling at her feet as the snow melted from her clothing. Her eyes took in everything: the bear hide rug, the iron pot hanging over the fire, the rifles mounted on the wall. Sarah's few toys arranged neatly on a shelf. "It's warm," she said softly, and there was wonder in her voice, as if warmth was something she'd forgotten existed. "Sarah, get the woman a blanket," Thomas instructed, "the wool one from the trunk." As Sarah scampered off, Margaret began unwrapping the oversized coat. Beneath it, her dress was torn at the shoulder, hastily mended with clumsy stitches. When she pushed back her sleeves to warm her hands at the fire, Thomas saw more bruises climbing up her arms like dark vines. "I can start supper," she said quickly, noticing his gaze. "If you show me where things are, I haven't eaten in 2 days, but I'll cook for you first, of course." "When did you last eat?" Sarah had returned with the blanket. Her young face creased with concern. Margaret wrapped the blanket around herself gratefully. "It doesn't matter. I'm here now." Thomas moved to the corner where he kept supplies: salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, a few withered potatoes. Not much, but enough. He'd planned to make the trek to the trading post next week, weather permitting. "Cook what you need," he said gruffly. "We eat together or not at all." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Thank you," she whispered. As she moved about the cabin, finding pots and implements, something changed in the air. It wasn't just the smell of food beginning to cook, though that was pleasant enough. It was something else. Something Thomas couldn't quite name. The way she hummed softly as she worked, perhaps. Or how she showed Sarah how to measure cornmeal with her small hands. "Like this?" Sarah asked, holding up a cup full of yellow meal. "Perfect," Margaret said, and Sarah beamed as if she'd been given a prize. "Now we add just a pinch of salt. Your papa has good supplies here. Some folks make do with much less." Thomas settled into his chair by the fire, pretending to mend a harness while he watched them. Margaret moved stiffly, favoring her left side, but her hands were sure and practiced as she prepared the meal. She found his small store of dried herbs, sage and wild onion he'd gathered in the fall, and used them like she knew exactly what she was doing. "My mama used to cook," Sarah announced. "But she went to heaven. Papa says she's watching us from the stars." Margaret's hand stilled for just a moment. "I'm sure she is," she said gently. "And I bet she's proud of what a helpful girl you are." When the meal was ready, simple fare transformed somehow into something that smelled like comfort itself. They sat together at Thomas's rough-hewn table. Margaret ate slowly, like someone who'd learned not to trust that food would always be there. Sarah chattered about her daily adventures, her collection of interesting rocks, the family of rabbits that lived under the woodpile. "Can she stay forever, Papa?" Sarah asked suddenly, cornbread crumbs on her chin. "She makes the house smell like a real home." The silence that followed was heavy as the snow still falling outside. Margaret kept her eyes on her plate, but Thomas saw her hands tremble slightly. "The storm will pass," he said finally. "It always does." But as he watched his daughter smile at this stranger who'd stumbled in from the cold, as he noticed how the firelight caught the red in Margaret's dark hair, as he remembered what it felt like to hear humming in his home again, Thomas wondered if some storms were meant to change things. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the cabin, for the first time in 3 years, something like peace settled over the small family, temporary, fragile, but undeniably present. The night was far from over, and, come morning, decisions would have to be made. But for now, there was warmth, food, and the quiet companionship of souls seeking shelter from more than just the weather. Sarah yawned, full-bellied and content. "I like when there's 3 of us," she murmured sleepily. Margaret and Thomas exchanged a glance across the table, his guarded, hers hopeful and terrified in equal measure. Neither spoke, but in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, that some people carry storms inside them that no amount of running can escape. And sometimes, just sometimes, the only shelter that matters is the kind found in the eyes of those who've weathered their own tempests and survived. The fire crackled in the hearth. The storm raged on outside. And Margaret O'Brien, whoever she really was, wherever she'd really come from, was, for tonight at least, home. The morning arrived wrapped in silence, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the small hours. Pale sunlight filtered through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Margaret woke with a start on the floor near the hearth, the wool blanket still wrapped tight around her shoulders. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back. She sat up slowly, her body protesting with aches that ran deep as mountain roots. The fire had died to embers, but warmth still radiated from the stones. Above her, she could hear soft movement from the loft where Thomas and Sarah slept, moving quietly. Margaret rose and surveyed the cabin in daylight. It was clean but spare, everything in its place with the careful order of a man who'd learned to manage alone. But there were signs of neglect too, curtains that needed mending, a child's dress with a torn hem hanging on a peg, dust in corners where a woman's eye would have caught it. She found the water bucket by the door, a thin layer of ice across the top, breaking it with her knuckles. She splashed her face and tried to make herself presentable. Her dress was beyond help, really travel-stained and worn thin at the elbows. But she smoothed it as best she could and began to quietly rebuild the fire. "You're still here." Sarah's voice made her jump. The child stood at the bottom of the loft ladder, bare feet on the cold floor, looking at Margaret with eyes full of wonder. Yes, should I not be?" Sarah padded over and sat cross-legged on the bare rug. "Papa thought you might leave in the night. He kept getting up to check. I heard him walking around." Margaret's hands stilled on the kindling. So Thomas had been watching, making sure she didn't rob them blind and disappear. She couldn't blame him. In his place, she'd have done the same. "Are you making breakfast?" Sarah asked. "I can help. Papa usually just makes mush, but yesterday you made it taste different. Better." "Would you like to learn?" Margaret asked, and Sarah's eager nod made her smile for the first time in weeks. "First, we need water." "Is there a well?" "There's a spring," Sarah said. "But Papa always gets the water. He says it's too dangerous for me alone." Thomas appeared then, descending the ladder with the quiet grace of a man used to moving through wild spaces. His dark eyes took in the scene, Margaret by the hearth, Sarah chattering away as if they'd known each other for years instead of hours. "I'll fetch water," he said simply, taking the bucket. "Sarah, show Miss O'Brien where we keep the breakfast things." He was gone before Margaret could offer to go herself, out into the crisp morning air that rushed in briefly through the door. Sarah immediately began pulling items from various corners, a sack of oats, precious sugar wrapped in paper, even a small crock of preserved berries. "Papa trades for these," Sarah explained about the berries. "The trader's wife feels sorry for us. I think she always adds extra things when Papa's not looking." Margaret's heart clenched at the matter-of-fact way the child spoke of pity. She knew that tone, had used it herself as a girl when the church ladies would slip her family extra food with significant looks. "Well," Margaret said brightly, "let's make something special with them. Shall we? Do you have milk?" "We have a cow," Sarah said proudly. "Her name is Bonnie. She's in the shed out back. Papa milks her every morning, but—" She glanced toward the door, then leaned in conspiratorially. "He's not very good at it. Bonnie doesn't like him much." When Thomas returned with the water, he found them giggling together over some private joke. Margaret showing Sarah how to measure oats with her palm. He set the bucket down harder than necessary, water sloshing. "Something amusing?" he asked. Margaret sobered immediately. "Sarah was just telling me about your livestock. If you'd like, I could help with the milking. I grew up on a farm. Before—" She trailed off, not wanting to finish that sentence. Thomas studied her for a long moment. In daylight, the bruises on her wrists were more visible. Purple-green marks that spoke of cruel hands. Her face, cleaned of yesterday's travel dust, was younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 25 winters. No more. There was a refinement to her features that didn't match the worn clothes and desperate circumstances. "Bonnie's particular about strangers," he said finally. "Most animals are," Margaret agreed. "But I've found they respond to gentleness and patience." Something in the way she said it made Thomas wonder if she was talking about more than just cows. After a simple breakfast that Margaret somehow made feel like a feast, the oats sweetened with berries, thin slices of fried salt pork, even a kind of flat cake made from the cornmeal, Sarah insisted on showing their guest around the property. "This is Papa's workshop," she said, pulling Margaret into a lean-to attached to the cabin. Tools hung neatly on the walls, and several pieces of furniture in various stages of completion stood about. "He makes things to trade. See, this is going to be a rocking chair." Margaret ran her hand along the smooth wood, admiring the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful work." "Papa's the best," Sarah said simply. "The trader says he could make lots of money in town, but Papa says town isn't for us." They visited Bonnie next, a placid brown cow who seemed perfectly content to let Margaret approach. Within minutes, she had the animal eating from her hand, and when she settled beside her with the milking pail, Bonnie didn't so much as switch her tail. "How did you do that?" Sarah breathed. "She always kicks when Papa tries." "Sometimes," Margaret said softly, her hands working in steady rhythm. "When you've been hurt, you can recognize it in others, even animals. It's about showing them you understand." Thomas watched from the doorway, arms crossed. This woman was full of contradictions, refined speech but practical skills, obvious breeding but desperate circumstances. The bruises told one story, but there had to be more. There always was. As the morning wore on, Margaret seemed to come alive in small ways. She helped Sarah feed the chickens, showing her how to scatter the grain so the smaller birds got their share. She noticed where the roof leaked and placed a pot to catch the drips. She even mended the torn curtain with the neat, tiny stitches that spoke of years of practice. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said as they worked together to shake out the bear rug. "Of course." "Why were you walking in the storm? Don't you have a home?" Margaret's hand stilled on the heavy fur. "I did have a home," she said carefully. "But sometimes a place stops being home, even if you still live there." "Why?" Thomas moved to intervene, but Margaret answered before he could speak. "Sometimes people change," she said. "Or maybe they were always one way, and you just didn't see it at first. And when home becomes a place where you're afraid." She swallowed hard. "Then you have to find somewhere else." Sarah considered this with the serious concentration of a child trying to understand adult sorrows. "Were you afraid?" "Yes." "Are you afraid now?" Margaret glanced at Thomas, then back at Sarah. "No," she said softly. "No, I'm not afraid now." The day passed in a strange kind of peace. Margaret seemed to know instinctively what needed doing, moving through the cabin as if she'd always been there. She prepared a midday meal from their simple stores that had Thomas wondering how he'd ever thought his own cooking adequate. She showed Sarah how to patch her torn dress with decorative stitching that made it look intentional. She even organized his workshop slightly, just enough to be helpful without overstepping. As afternoon shadows grew long, Margaret began preparing what would presumably be her last meal with them. The storm had passed. The trail would be clear by morning. Thomas had said nothing about her staying longer, and she wouldn't ask. She'd learned the hard way that pushing for more than was offered freely led only to pain. "You're different from this morning," Sarah observed, helping to set the table. "Less scared-looking." Margaret smiled sadly. "Sometimes a single day of kindness can work miracles." "Then you should stay for lots of days," Sarah said with 6-year-old logic. "Think of all the miracles." The word hung in the air as they sat down to dinner. Stay. Such a simple word, but weighted with so much possibility and complication. Thomas had built a life here away from the judgment and violence of town. He'd protected Sarah from the worst of what the world thought about half-blood children. Could he risk that for a woman he'd known less than a day? But as he watched Margaret help Sarah with her food, as he noticed how his daughter laughed more today than she had in months, as he felt the difference her presence made in the very air of the cabin, he wondered if the greater risk might be in letting her go. Outside, the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight and something more, the fragile warmth of connection between damaged souls. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, there was this: a meal shared, a child's laughter, and the possibility that sometimes storms brought more than just destruction. Margaret felt it too, this sense of belonging she hadn't expected to find. As she began clearing the dishes, she allowed herself one dangerous thought: what if this could be home? What if she could stay? What if? But she pushed the thought away. She'd learned not to hope for too much. For now, it was enough to have this one perfect day of being useful, wanted, safe. Tomorrow she would leave, as agreed. Tonight, she would memorize every detail: Sarah's giggle, Thomas's quiet strength, the way the firelight made everything golden and warm. "Thank you," she said softly as Thomas handed her the last plate. "For everything." He nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. Neither of them spoke of tomorrow. There would be time enough for endings when the sun rose again. The sound of horses approaching shattered the morning quiet, like glass breaking. Thomas was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard them, 3, maybe 4 riders, moving up the trail with the deliberate pace of men who expected to be received. He set down his axe and moved quickly to the front of the cabin, his hand instinctively checking the knife at his belt. Sheriff William Brennan rode at the head of the group, his tin star catching the early sunlight. Behind him came 2 deputies Thomas recognized, young men from town who looked uncomfortable to be this far into Apache territory. They reined in their horses a respectful distance from the cabin, but their presence alone was threat enough. "Morning, Blackfeather," the sheriff said, not dismounting. He was a weathered man in his 50s, fair-minded as lawmen went, but still bound by the prejudices of the territory. "Heard you might have taken in a visitor during the storm." Thomas said nothing, his dark eyes giving away nothing. Inside the cabin, he could hear Margaret moving about, probably already aware of the danger these men represented. "Woman named Margaret O'Brien," Brennan continued, shifting in his saddle. "Though that might not be her real name. Red hair, young, pretty enough. Ring any bells?" "Storm brought many things to my door," Thomas said evenly. "Wind, snow, cold. I don't turn away those seeking shelter from nature's fury." One of the deputies, a boy barely old enough to shave, spoke up with the bravado of youth. "She's a runaway wife, Apache, belongs to Charles Morrison down in Cedar Falls. He's offering good money for her return." The name hit Thomas like cold water. Charles Morrison. He knew that name. A mine owner with more money than morals, known for his violent temper and his belief that everything could be bought or beaten into submission. Thomas had seen his type before, men who treated their wives like property and their workers like animals. If a woman runs into a blizzard rather than stay in her home, Thomas said slowly, "Perhaps you should ask what she was running from." Brennan's face hardened. "Now, that's not your business. Is it the law's the law? A wife belongs with her husband. Even if he beats her." The words came from behind Thomas. Margaret stood in the doorway, Sarah clutching her skirts. The morning light revealed what shadows had hidden, the fading yellow of an old bruise on her cheekbone, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. The sheriff had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Mrs. Morrison." "My name is O'Brien," Margaret said firmly. "I took back my father's name when I left. And yes, Sheriff, I left After 2 years of marriage, that would make even you blush to hear about." "She's lying," the young deputy interjected. "Mr. Morrison said she's prone to hysteria, making up stories." "Then why?" Margaret asked quietly. "Did he wait 3 days to report me missing? Why didn't he come himself to fetch his beloved wife? Could it be he was waiting for his own bruises to fade, the ones he got when I finally fought back?" Sarah pressed closer to Margaret, her young face troubled by the tension. Thomas noticed how Margaret's hand came to rest protectively on the child's head, even as she faced down armed men. "Ladies shouldn't speak of such things," Brennan said, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "And there are other concerns. Morrison says you took things when you left. Jewelry, money." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I took my mother's wedding ring, the one from her first marriage, not the one Charles bought. And yes, I took money, $20 from the household funds. After 2 years of managing his home, raising his status, enduring his attention, I thought $20 was poor payment, but it was all I could carry." "Papa," Sarah whispered, "why are they being mean to Miss Margaret?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Thomas felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same rage he'd carried since childhood, when he'd first learned that his mother's people were considered less than human, that his father's white blood couldn't wash away the stain of his Apache heritage. "They're not being mean, little one," Margaret said gently. "They're doing what they think is right. Sometimes people follow rules even when the rules are wrong." Brennan cleared his throat. "Look here, Blackfeather, I'm not unsympathetic, but Morrison's an important man. He's got connections, influence. If you harbor his wife, there'll be consequences. For you and the girl." The threat was subtle, but clear. Thomas had worked hard to build a life outside the reach of town politics. But he wasn't naive. Morrison's money could make things difficult, could bring more than just lawmen to his door. "She sought shelter," Thomas said. "Apache law says those who seek sanctuary cannot be turned away." "This ain't Apache land anymore," the young deputy said with a sneer. "This is American territory, and American law says a man owns his wife like he owns his horse." Margaret interrupted, her voice rising. "Says he can do what he likes behind closed doors. Says if she runs, she must be brought back like escaped property." She stepped forward, and Thomas saw her hands were shaking, but her chin was high. "I won't go back. You'll have to drag me. Sheriff, is that what you want, to drag a woman screaming back to a man who—" She stopped, glancing at Sarah. Brennan removed his hat, ran a hand through his graying hair. "Now, nobody said anything about dragging. We're civilized men here. But ma'am, you need to understand, if you don't come voluntary-like, Morrison will just hire bounty hunters, men who won't be as polite as we are." "Then I'll keep running," Margaret said simply. "I'll run until I can't anymore. But I won't go back to that house. I won't go back to him." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Thomas could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. These men could take Margaret by force. 3 armed men against 1 Apache and 2 females, but Brennan was a decent man at heart, and Thomas could see him struggling with duty and conscience. "Sheriff," Thomas said finally, "the woman has been here 2 days. She's worked for her keep. Nothing more. If Morrison wants to claim otherwise, let him come himself and say it." "You know he won't come to Apache land," Brennan said. "Man's got a powerful fear of your kind." Thomas smiled then, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Smart man." The young deputy's hand twitched toward his gun, but Brennan stopped him with a look. "I'll tell you what," the sheriff said slowly. "I'll report that we searched the area but found no sign of Mrs. Morrison. Could be she headed south to Mexico. Lots of folks disappear across that border." Margaret sagged with relief, but Brennan wasn't finished. "But ma'am, you should know, this ain't over. Morrison's not the type to let things go. And Blackfeather, you should think hard about what you're risking. The girl there, she's what, 6'7"? Pretty little thing. Be a shame if Morrison decided to make trouble for her father. The threat against Sarah made Thomas's vision go red at the edges. His hand found the axe handle leaning against the cabin wall. Any man who threatens my daughter will find out why the Apache held this land for 1,000 years before you came. Brennan raised his hands placatingly. Nobody's threatening nobody, just pointing out facts. You've stayed out of town business, and town stayed out of yours. Be good to keep it that way. He turned his horse, the deputies following reluctantly. The young one looked back, his face twisted with frustration. This ain't right, he muttered. Harboring a runaway wife, probably warming his bed already. Johnson, Brennan's voice cracked like a whip. You'll keep a civil tongue or I'll have your badge. We're leaving. They watched the riders disappear down the trail, dust settling in their wake. Sarah broke the silence first. Why did that man say you belonged to someone else? She asked Margaret. People don't belong to people. That's what Papa said about why we don't live in town. Margaret knelt beside the child, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Your Papa is right, but sometimes the law says different things than what's right. Then the law is wrong, Sarah said with the simple clarity of childhood. Thomas looked at Margaret then, really looked at her, saw the courage it had taken to face those men, to speak her truth even knowing it might not save her, saw how she'd protected Sarah from the ugliest parts of what was being said, saw a woman who'd chosen the uncertainty of a blizzard over the certainty of continued abuse. You can't stay here, he said quietly. They'll be back. Maybe not Brennan, but others. Morrison's type doesn't give up easy. Margaret nodded, straightening. I know. I'll leave today. Head south like the sheriff suggested. I've caused you enough trouble. No. The word surprised him as much as her. That's not what I meant. You can't stay here in the open. But there's an old hunting cabin, higher up the mountain, hidden. Only the Apache know about it. He paused, weighing risks and possibilities. You could stay there for a while. Papa, Sarah clapped her hands. Does this mean she's staying? Thomas looked at his daughter's shining face, then at Margaret's mix of hope and fear. It means she's not running anymore. Not alone, anyway. Margaret's composure finally cracked. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sarah immediately wrapped her small arms around Margaret's waist, and after a moment, Thomas placed one large hand on her shoulder. Thank you, Margaret whispered. I know what you're risking. I don't know how to thank you. Keep making Sarah smile, Thomas said gruffly. That's thanks enough. But even as they stood there in the morning sun, a makeshift family formed by circumstance and choice, Thomas knew this was just the beginning. Morrison would come, in one form or another. The town's whispers would grow louder, and somewhere in the shadows between Apache tradition and American law, they would have to find a way to survive. For now, though, there was this moment. Sarah chattering about the secret cabin, Margaret wiping her eyes and trying to smile, the mountains standing eternal guard around them. It wasn't safety, not really, but it was a start. The night was thick with silence when Margaret's muffled sobs finally broke through. She sat on the floor of the hunting cabin, arms wrapped around her knees, trying to stifle the sounds that seemed to tear from her chest without permission. Sarah, who was supposed to be asleep on the small cot Thomas had fashioned from pine branches and old blankets, stirred and sat up. Miss Margaret, the child's voice was soft with concern. Are you hurt? Margaret quickly wiped her face, though it was too dark for Sarah to see clearly. No, sweetheart, I'm sorry I woke you. Go back to sleep. But Sarah was already climbing down from the cot, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She settled beside Margaret, small body warm against her side. Papa cries sometimes too, she whispered. At night when he thinks I'm sleeping. He misses Mama. The simple honesty of it made Margaret's tears flow harder. She pulled Sarah close, This child who had shown her more genuine kindness in 3 days than she'd known in 2 years of marriage. "What makes you sad?" Sarah asked, patting Margaret's arm with the unconscious comfort children offer. Margaret struggled to find words that wouldn't burden a 6-year-old with adult sorrows. Sometimes people say things about you that aren't true, and after a while, you start to wonder if maybe they're right." "What kind of things?" Margaret closed her eyes, hearing Charles's voice in her memory, the words he'd used to break her down, piece by piece: worthless, barren, unclean, damaged goods. The names had been almost worse than the blows, burrowing under her skin like thorns that festered. "Mean things," she said finally. "Things that make you feel small and dirty and wrong." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this. "The boys in town call me half-breed," she said matter-of-factly. "They say I don't belong anywhere. Not with the Apache, not with the whites. Papa says they're ignorant, that I belong wherever I choose to stand. Your papa is a wise man. He also says that words only have the power we give them." Sarah snuggled closer. "But that's hard sometimes." "Yes," Margaret whispered. "It's very hard sometimes." They heard footsteps on the path outside, Thomas's familiar tread. He entered quietly, carrying an armload of firewood. In the dim light from the banked coals, Margaret could see his face was drawn with worry. "Couldn't sleep," he said by way of explanation, though Margaret suspected he'd been keeping watch. "Thought I'd check the fire." As he knelt to add wood to the hearth, Sarah piped up. "Miss Margaret is sad because someone said mean things about her, like how the town boys call me names." Thomas's hand stilled on the kindling. He looked at Margaret over his shoulder, and she saw understanding in his dark eyes. He knew about words that cut deeper than knives, about shame that wasn't earned but was given anyway. "Sarah," he said quietly, "why don't you go back to bed? I'll stay with Miss Margaret for a while." The child looked between them, then nodded with a wisdom beyond her years. She kissed Margaret's cheek before climbing back onto her cot. Within minutes, her breathing had evened into sleep. Thomas finished building up the fire, then sat on the floor across from Margaret, his back against the wall. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the flames dance. "You want to tell me about it?" he asked finally. "Sometimes speaking poison draws it out." Margaret drew her knees up tighter. "I don't know where to start." "Start with why a woman like you married a man like Morrison." A bitter laugh escaped her. "A woman like me, you don't know what kind of woman I am." "I know enough." She looked at him then, this giant of a man who'd taken her in without questions, who was risking his own safety and his daughter's for a stranger. "My father died when I was 20, she began slowly. "Left debts, so many debts. The farm was gone. My mother was sick. My younger sisters needed—" She swallowed. "Charles Morrison offered to pay everything, said he'd fallen in love with me at first sight, wanted to take care of my family. I was grateful. I thought I was lucky." Thomas made a sound that might have been understanding or anger. "The first months weren't terrible. He was possessive, jealous, but I thought it was passion. Then I failed to give him a child." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "That's when I learned what kind of man I'd married. He said I was defective, barren soil. He called me, said he'd bought damaged goods." "You're not goods," Thomas said firmly. "You're not property to be bought or sold." "I know that now, but when you hear something every day, when the person who's supposed to love you tells you you're worthless." She pressed her palms against her eyes. "He was careful at first, never hit where it would show, never in front of servants. But as time went on, he got bolder, said no one would believe me anyway, said everyone knew what kind of woman lets herself be sold to pay family debts." The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Thomas was quiet, but it was an active quiet, full of listening. "The worst part," Margaret continued, "was that I started to believe him, started to think I deserved it, that this was my punishment for being for sale in the first place. She laughed, but it was a broken sound. Even now, sitting here, I wonder, what kind of decent woman runs away from her marriage? What kind of woman hides in the mountains with a man she barely knows? A survivor, Thomas said simply. Same as any creature that runs from a forest fire or a rabid wolf. Survival isn't shameful. Margaret looked at him through her tears. Your wife, Sarah's mother, you loved her. With everything I had. There was no hesitation in his answer. Mary was sunlight, laughter. She saw past what others saw, not a half-breed too Apache for the whites and too white for the Apache, but just Thomas. His voice roughened. When the fever took her, I wanted to follow. Would have, if not for Sarah. I'm sorry. Don't be. Having loved her, having been loved by her, that was gift enough for any lifetime. He paused, studying Margaret's face in the firelight. But she would have hated what I became after. Shut away, teaching Sarah to fear the world beyond our mountain. You were protecting her. Was I, or was I hiding? He shook his head. These past days, watching you with her, seeing how hungry she was for a woman's teaching, I think maybe I was protecting myself more than her. They fell silent again. But it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with shared understanding rather than isolation. Charles will come, Margaret said eventually. Or send men. I've brought danger to your door. Danger was already here. Thomas replied, You think we were safe before an Apache man with a half-blood daughter? Living alone, the only thing that's kept the worst away is fear. Fear of what I might do if pushed. But fear only works so long. I could leave. Head south like the sheriff suggested. You could. Thomas stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. Sarah would cry for weeks, maybe months. She's already lost one mother. Margaret's breath caught. I'm not her mother. No, but you could be something, if you wanted. He set the stick aside, meeting her eyes directly. I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give. Not like him, never like him. But if you stay as family, my protection, my home, my name if you want it. Not because I bought you or own you, but because Sarah needs you, because maybe we both do. The offer hung between them, momentous and terrifying. Margaret felt the old voices rising. Charles's voice, her mother's voice warning about propriety. Society's voice whispering about fallen women and scandal. But stronger than all of them was Sarah's voice, clear and true. People don't belong to people. I'm damaged, she whispered. In ways that might not heal. I might never give you children. I might never be whole. Thomas moved then, slowly, carefully, until he was sitting beside her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was solid, comforting. We're all damaged, he said quietly. Every one of us walking this earth. Some wounds show, some don't, some heal, some we carry forever. Doesn't make us worth less, just makes us human. Margaret turned to look at him. This man who'd offered her sanctuary without expectation, who spoke of protection without possession. Why? She asked. Why would you do this? Because Sarah asked if you could stay forever, he said simply. And for the first time in 3 years, I wanted to say yes to her. Because you look at me and see Thomas, not the Apache or the giant. Because you made my house smell like bread and laughter again. He paused, then added more quietly. Because when those men came today, threatening you, I wanted to kill them. Not from duty or obligation, but because the thought of you going back to him, made something in my chest feel like it was breaking. Margaret's tears had stopped sometime during his words. She felt scrubbed clean, empty but not hollow. If I stay, she said carefully, it has to be as equals. Partners. I won't trade one master for another, no matter how kind. Agreed. And I might not be ready for everything marriage means. Not for a while. Maybe not ever. I'm a patient man.
And if Charles comes?
When he comes, Thomas corrected. We face him together, all of us. Margaret looked toward the cot where Sarah slept peacefully, then back at Thomas. His face was patient, kind, offering her something she'd never had, a choice freely made, a future unbought and unowned. "All right," she whispered. "I'll stay." Thomas smiled then, a rare, full smile that transformed his stern features. He stood, offering her his hand to help her up. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. "Welcome home, Margaret O'Brien," he said softly. And for the first time in years, despite the danger lurking beyond their mountain, despite the wounds still tender in her soul, Margaret felt something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. The laughter came first, carried on the wind like the stench of cheap whiskey and malice. Thomas heard it from inside the cabin where he was showing Margaret how to work the peculiar latch on the storage cellar. His body went rigid, every instinct screaming danger. "Take Sarah," he said quietly, already moving toward his rifle. "Go to the root cellar, now!" Margaret didn't question, just grabbed Sarah's hand and moved swiftly to the trap door he'd just shown her. But they were only halfway there when the door burst open, banging against the wall with enough force to shake dust from the rafters. 5 men stumbled in, their faces flushed with drink and something uglier. Thomas recognized 3 of them, Jack Morrison, Charles's younger brother, and 2 hands from the Morrison mine. The other 2 were strangers, probably hired guns brought in for this exact purpose. "Well, well," Jack slurred, his eyes finding Margaret immediately. "There's our runaway filly. Charles is mighty upset with you. Maggie had to take his temper out on the furniture instead." Margaret pulled Sarah behind her, backing slowly toward the corner. The child was trembling, but silent, her father's teachings about danger evident in her stillness. "You're not welcome here," Thomas said, his voice low and controlled. He stood between the men and the women, the rifle held loosely but ready. "Leave, now." Jack laughed, an ugly sound. "Leave, we just got here besides. We come for what belongs to my brother. Ain't leaving without her." "The woman stays," Thomas said simply. "The woman," one of the hired guns, a scarred man with dead eyes, spat tobacco juice on the clean floor. "That what you're calling Charles's wife now your woman." The others laughed, the sound filling the cabin like smoke. Jack swayed forward, pointing an unsteady finger at Thomas. Should have known better than to trust an Apache with a white woman. Probably been mounting her like the savage you are. "Don't," Margaret said suddenly, seeing Thomas's knuckles whiten on the rifle. "That's what they want. Don't give them an excuse." "Listen to her," Jack mocked. "Already trained you good. Has Charles trained her real well? She knows how to make a man happy. Don't you, Maggie Corse? She couldn't do the one thing a wife's supposed to do, dry as desert sand, the doctor said." Margaret flinched as if struck. Sarah made a small sound of distress, not understanding the words but feeling their cruelty. "Though, maybe," Jack continued, his voice dropping to something even uglier. "Maybe she just needed a different plow for her field. That what you've been doing up here. Apache trying to plant where my brother couldn't." The rifle moved so fast the drunk men barely saw it, the stock crashing into Jack's jaw with a crack that echoed off the walls. He went down hard, blood streaming from his mouth. "Papa, no!" Sarah's cry broke the moment of stunned silence. The hired guns went for their weapons, but Thomas was already moving, a lifetime of warrior training evident in every motion. He swept one man's legs, sending him crashing into his partner. The rifle spun in his hands, catching another across the temple. But there were too many, and they weren't all drunk. The scarred gunman got his pistol clear, pointing it not at Thomas but at Margaret and Sarah. "Stop right there, Apache," he said coldly, "or I put a hole through your women." Thomas froze, chest heaving, blood running from a cut above his eye where someone had landed a lucky blow. Jack struggled to his feet, spitting blood and teeth. His jovial mask had slipped, revealing the same cruel core that lived in his brother. "You're gonna pay for that, savage! But first," he lurched toward Margaret. "First, we're taking what we came for." Margaret stepped forward, pushing Sarah further behind her. "I'm not going back." "Ain't your choice." Jack snarled. "You're bought and paid for. Charles has the papers to prove it. Marriage certificate, receipts for your daddy's debts, all legal and proper." "Legal?" Margaret said, her voice shaking but determined. "Like slavery was legal, like stealing Apache land was legal." One of the miners laughed nastily. "She's got a mouth on her now. Charles'll have to break her all over again." "Maybe we should save him the trouble," the other suggested, eyes roving over Margaret in a way that made Thomas growl low in his throat. "Break her in some on the trail back." "You touch her," Thomas said, each word precise as a blade, "and I'll kill every last one of you." "With what?" The scarred gunman kept his pistol trained on Margaret. "You move, I shoot. Simple as that." Jack wiped blood from his mouth, his eyes glittering with pain and rage. "Here's what's gonna happen. Maggie comes with us, nice and quiet. The Apache and his brat stay here, alive, long as they don't follow. Everyone goes home happy." "Except Margaret," Sarah said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the tension. "She won't be happy. She'll be scared and sad and hurt." Jack's face twisted. "Shut that half-breed brat up before I—" He never finished the sentence. Margaret moved like lightning, grabbing the heavy iron pot from the stove and swinging it into the scarred gunman's wrist. His shot went wild, the bullet embedding in the ceiling. Thomas lunged forward, catching Jack around the throat, while Margaret brought the pot down on another man's head. The cabin erupted into chaos. Fists flew. Furniture crashed. Men shouted and cursed. Sarah scrambled under the table, hands over her ears, trying to block out the violence that had invaded their sanctuary. Margaret fought with the desperate strength of someone who knew exactly what awaited her if she lost. When one of the miners grabbed her arm, she bit down hard enough to taste blood. When another tried to pin her against the wall, she drove her knee into his groin with vicious accuracy. But gradually, inevitably, numbers began to tell. Thomas was strong, but he was one man against 5. Blood ran from multiple cuts, his movements growing slower. One of the hired guns got behind him, arm around his throat, choking. "Stop!" Jack commanded, pointing his recovered pistol at Sarah's hiding spot. "Everyone stop, or I put one through the table." The fighting ceased, leaving only harsh breathing and groans of pain. Margaret stood swaying, her dress torn, hair wild, a bruise already forming on her cheek. Thomas was on his knees, the gunman's arm still around his neck. "There we go," Jack said, satisfaction in his voice despite his smashed mouth. "Now, Maggie, you come along quiet-like, and nobody else gets hurt." Margaret looked at Thomas, at Sarah cowering under the table, at the men who would drag her back to hell. For a moment, her shoulders sagged in defeat. Then she straightened, lifting her chin. "No, no," Jack laughed incredulously. "You see the gun pointed at the brat?" "I see it," Margaret said quietly. "I also see men who had to come in numbers, drunk, with weapons, to face one man and 2 females. I see cowards who talk about law while breaking into a man's home. I see the truth of what Charles Morrison is, written in the actions of those who serve him." She took a step forward, and Jack's gun swung toward her. "You won't shoot me," she said with strange calm. "Charles wants me alive, wants me back under his roof, his control. A dead wife is no good to him." "Maybe not dead," Jack snarled. "But he didn't say nothing about undamaged." The gun shifted, pointing at her leg. Margaret didn't flinch. "You know what your brother does to things that are damaged," she said softly. "Do you really want to bring him broken goods?" Jack hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, they all heard it. Horses approaching fast. Lots of them. "Boss?" one of the hired guns said nervously. "That sounds like—" The door flew open again, But this time it was Sheriff Brennan who entered, followed by 6 deputies, all with weapons drawn. The sheriff took in the scene, the wrecked cabin, the blood, the weapons pointed at women and child. "Drop the guns," he ordered coldly. "Every last one of you." "Sheriff," Jack started, "we're just collecting." "I know what you're doing." Brennan cut him off. "Got a wire from Cedar Falls. Seems Charles Morrison was found this morning, dead drunk and raving about hiring men to kidnap his wife. His very sober business partners are quite concerned about the scandal." His smile was thin. "They've convinced him to file for divorce instead. Quieter that way." The guns lowered slowly, the fight going out of the intruders like air from a punctured bladder. "Divorce," Margaret whispered, hardly daring to believe. "On grounds of abandonment." Brennan confirmed. "You'll be free to marry again in 6 months. Though somehow I doubt Charles will contest if you don't wait that long." He looked meaningfully at Thomas. Jack's face was purple with rage and humiliation. "This ain't over," he snarled at Margaret. "Charles might let you go legal, but the Morrison family don't forget insults. You'll pay for this, both of you." "That sounds like a threat," Brennan observed mildly. "Boys, arrest Mr. Morrison and his friends for breaking and entering, assault, and threatening murder. They can cool off in my jail for a few months." As the deputies moved in, Jack locked eyes with Margaret one last time. "You think you won?" he hissed. "You're nothing but used goods, barren waste. He'll figure that out soon enough. And then where will you be?" Margaret felt the old pain slice through her. But before she could respond, Sarah crawled out from under the table and marched up to Jack. "You're mean and ugly and stupid," the child announced clearly. "And Miss Margaret is worth 100 of you." Then she kicked him in the shin as hard as she could. Despite everything, the violence, the fear, the cruel words still echoing in the air, Margaret found herself laughing. She scooped Sarah up, hugging her tight, as the deputies hauled the cursing men away. When they were gone, leaving only the 3 of them and Sheriff Brennan, the lawman looked around the wrecked cabin with sympathy. "You folks might want to stay in town for a few days," he suggested. "Let things calm down." "We'll stay here," Thomas said firmly, one arm around Margaret, the other hand on Sarah's head. "This is our home." Brennan nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that. I'll have men patrol the area for a while, just in case." He tipped his hat to Margaret. "Ma'am, for what it's worth, I think you're a brave woman. Not many would stand up to the Morrisons." After he left, they stood in the ruins of their home, processing what had happened. The violence had been ugly, terrifying, but they had survived it. Together. "Are you hurt?" Thomas asked Margaret, gently touching the bruise on her cheek. "Nothing that won't heal," she assured him, then looked down at Sarah. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "Those men said mean things about you, but they were wrong." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "How do you know?" "Because," Sarah said simply, "people who say mean things are always wrong. Papa taught me that." Thomas pulled them both close, and they stood there among the overturned furniture and broken dishes, a family forged in crisis, strengthened by trial. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of hope. They had work ahead of them, a cabin to repair, a divorce to finalize, a future to build. But for now, this was enough, the 3 of them together. Safe, free. The storm had passed. The morning would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. And Margaret, for the first time in years, was ready to meet them. The weeks following the attack had settled into an uneasy quiet. Thomas had repaired the broken furniture. Margaret had scrubbed away the bloodstains. And Sarah had slowly stopped jumping at sudden noises. But beneath the surface routine, all 3 of them were waiting for Jack Morrison to make good on his threats, for Charles to change his mind about the divorce, for the other shoe to drop. It was a Sunday morning when Margaret finally broke. They were preparing for their weekly trip to the trading post, a journey that had become fraught with tension. The townspeople's stares had grown bolder, their whispers louder. Margaret knew what they called her: the Morrison woman, the runaway wife, the Apache's whore. "I don't have to go," she said quietly, watching Thomas load supplies onto the wagon. "You and Sarah can manage." Thomas looked up from checking the horse's harness. "You're part of this family. We go together. Your family doesn't deserve to be tainted by my reputation." The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with weeks of swallowed shame and midnight doubts. Thomas set down the reins and came to where she stood in the doorway, Sarah playing with her doll nearby. "Margaret." "No," she interrupted, weeks of silence breaking like a dam. "You heard what they say, what they all say. Used goods, barren, damaged. And they're right, aren't they? I couldn't give Charles children. I probably can't give you any either. I'm just broken." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she turned away, unable to bear the pity she was sure she'd see in his eyes. But Thomas caught her shoulders gently, turning her back to face him. "Look at me," he said softly. When she kept her eyes down, he repeated more firmly, "Margaret, look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly, expecting disappointment, maybe even regret. Instead, she found something that made her breath catch, a fierce protectiveness mixed with something deeper, warmer. "You are not broken," Thomas said, each word deliberate and clear. "You are not goods, used or otherwise. You are a woman who survived years of cruelty with her spirit intact. You are the one who makes Sarah laugh, who turned our house back into a home, who stood up to armed men rather than go back to a life of fear." "But I can't." "Give me children." He shook his head. "I have Sarah. She's enough, more than enough. If you could have a dozen babies, but were cruel to her, would I want you here? No. But you love her like she was your own. That's what matters." Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "The whole town thinks." "I've lived my whole life with what towns think," Thomas interrupted. "They think I'm a savage, think Sarah is an abomination, think we don't belong. You know what I've learned? Their thoughts have only the power we give them." "It's not that simple," Margaret protested. "Isn't it?" He released her shoulders but didn't step back. "When Jack Morrison pointed a gun at Sarah, when he threatened to drag you back to his brother, did you care what he thought of you?" "No, but when you hit that gunman with the pot, when you fought like a mountain cat to stay free, were you thinking about being proper, being what the town expects?" Margaret almost smiled despite her tears. "No." "Then why?" Thomas asked gently. "Do you give their words power now, when the danger is past?" From across the yard, Sarah's clear voice rang out, "Miss Margaret, look what I found." They turned to see the child holding up a small wildflower, its purple petals bright against the morning sun. She ran over, presenting it to Margaret with a flourish. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, kneeling to accept the gift. "It was growing in the rocks," Sarah explained seriously. "Papa says the strongest flowers grow in the hardest places, like you." Margaret looked at the flower, delicate but resilient, blooming despite the rocky soil. "Like me." "You grew strong in a hard place," Sarah said simply, "and now you're blooming here with us." Margaret pulled the child into a fierce hug, hiding her face in Sarah's dark hair. Over the girl's shoulder, she met Thomas's eyes and saw her own emotions reflected there: love, fear, hope, and determination mixed in equal measure. "All right," she said finally, standing and squaring her shoulders. "Let's go to town." The journey down the mountain was quiet, each of them preparing in their own way for what awaited. As the trading post came into view, Margaret could already see people gathering, their Sunday-best clothes a sharp contrast to the ugliness in some of their expressions. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, was the first to approach as they climbed down from the wagon. Her face was pinched with disapproval, her voice carrying deliberately. "I suppose some people have no shame," she announced to her companions. "Living in sin, corrupting a child. It's disgraceful." Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her, but she touched his arm lightly. "I've got this," she murmured. She walked directly to Mrs. Henderson, Sarah's hand in hers, and smiled pleasantly. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. Lovely weather for judging others, isn't it?" The woman's face went red. "How dare you?" "How dare I what?" Margaret asked calmly. "Walk freely, refuse to be beaten anymore. Choose who I live with. Which of those offends you most?" A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the promise of drama. Margaret could feel their eyes like insects crawling on her skin, but she kept her chin high. "You're living with a man not your husband, Mrs. Henderson hissed. "Setting a terrible example for that poor child." "Ah, yes," Margaret said. "Much better she learned that women should stay with men who hurt them, that marriage is a bill of sale rather than a partnership. Those are much better lessons, aren't they?" The Bible says a lot of things," Margaret interrupted, "including, 'Judge not lest ye be judged.' But I suppose you skip that part." Someone in the crowd snickered. "Mrs." Henderson's face went from red to purple. "You're nothing but a—" "Careful," Thomas said quietly, stepping forward. "Choose your next words very carefully. Ma'am." The woman backed up a step, suddenly remembering exactly who she was insulting. But she rallied, drawing on the courage of the crowd. "The whole town knows what she is. What kind of woman leaves her lawful husband to take up with me?" Thomas supplied helpfully. "The word you're looking for is Apache, or maybe savage heathen. I've heard them all." Young Mr. Davies, the banker's son, pushed forward with the bravado of youth and privilege. "She's made her choice. Let her live with it. No decent man will have Charles Morrison's leavings anyway." The words hung in the air like a slap. Margaret felt them hit, felt the old shame rising. But then Sarah's hand squeezed hers, and she remembered the purple flower growing through rocks. "You're absolutely right," Margaret said clearly, making sure her voice carried. "I have made my choice. I chose bruises over comfort. I chose uncertainty over cruelty. I chose a man who sees me as a person rather than property." She looked around at the gathered faces. "And if that makes me indecent in your eyes, then I'll wear your scorn like a badge of honor." An older woman near the back, Mrs. Garrett, who ran the boarding house, spoke up unexpectedly. "Takes courage to leave," she said quietly. "More courage than staying silent." "Mrs. Henderson whirled on her. "Surely you're not defending—" "I'm stating a fact," Mrs. Garrett said firmly. "We all know what Charles Morrison is. We've all seen the servants he's driven off, heard the stories. If she found the strength to leave, more power to her." "But she's living in sin," Davies protested. "Am I?" Margaret asked. "Thomas has been nothing but honorable. We have separate sleeping quarters until my divorce is final and we can marry properly. Can all of you say the same about your courtships?" Several faces in the crowd reddened. Margaret knew for a fact that the Davies boy had been caught in compromising positions more than once. Sheriff Brennan chose that moment to arrive, taking in the scene with weary eyes. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem, Sheriff," Thomas said calmly. "Just some good Christian folks sharing their opinions." "Well, maybe they could share them somewhere else." Brennan suggested. "This is a place of business, not a pulpit." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, but not before several more cutting remarks were thrown Margaret's way. She stood straight through all of it, Sarah's hand in hers, Thomas's solid presence at her back. When they finally entered the trading post, Mr. Jameson, the proprietor, greeted them with his usual gruff nod. "Got your order ready. Blackfeather. Added some extra salt pork winters coming early this year." As Thomas handled the business, Margaret felt a touch on her sleeve. She turned to find a young woman she vaguely recognized, one of the Morrison house servants. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," the girl whispered. "But I wanted to say, we're all glad you got away. He was, well, we're glad." Before Margaret could respond, the girl slipped away, leaving Margaret staring after her with burning eyes. The trip home was accomplished in relative peace, though Margaret could feel the weight of stairs following them. As they climbed back into the mountains, Sarah broke the silence. "Why were those people so mean to you?" Margaret considered how to explain prejudice and judgment to a 6-year-old. Sometimes people are afraid of those who make different choices than they would. It makes them angry. "But you didn't do anything wrong." "No," Thomas said firmly. "She didn't. But sometimes doing right looks wrong to those who've never had to make hard choices." As their cabin came into view, Margaret felt the tension finally leaving her shoulders. This was home now. Whatever the town thought. That evening, as she helped Sarah prepare for bed, the child asked, "Are you sad about what those people said?" Margaret considered lying, but Sarah deserved honesty. "A little. Words can hurt, even when we know they're not true." Sarah nodded solemnly. "When the town boys call me names, Papa tells me to remember who I really am. Maybe you should remember too." "And who am I?" Margaret asked softly. Sarah smiled. "You're Margaret. You make the best cornbread and tell the best stories and give the warmest hugs. You're brave and kind, and you're ours now." She paused, then added firmly, "And that's worth more than all their words put together." Margaret hugged the child close, feeling something heal inside her chest. "You're absolutely right." Later, as she sat by the fire with Thomas, she said quietly, "Thank you for standing with me today." "Always," he replied simply. "That's what family does." Margaret looked around the cabin at Sarah's drawings on the wall, at the curtains she'd mended, at the life they were building together despite all opposition. The town's words still stung, might always sting a little, but here in this home, with these people who saw her truly, she could feel herself growing stronger. Like a wildflower through rocks, she thought, blooming despite the hardness all around. "I'm not ashamed," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Let them talk. I know who I am now." Thomas smiled, reaching over to take her hand. "So do I." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying away the echoes of cruel words and leaving only the solid truth of the present. A family, chosen and cherished, standing strong against whatever storms might come. The night air hung thick and still, unusual for the mountain. Thomas woke instantly, his warrior's instincts screaming danger before his conscious mind caught up. Beside him on the cabin floor, he'd taken to sleeping there since the first attack, leaving the bed to Margaret and Sarah. He could hear the dog's low growl. Then came the smell. Kerosene, smoke. "Fire!" he roared, leaping to his feet. "Margaret, get Sarah." The response was immediate. Margaret bolted upright, grabbed Sarah from the bed, and wrapped her in a blanket. Thomas was already at the window, peering through the gaps in the shutters. "How many?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. 6, maybe 7. He grabbed his rifle, checking the load. "They're spreading kerosene around the walls." As if to confirm his words, a voice rang out from the darkness. "Apache, send out Morrison's woman, and we'll let you and the half-breed brat leave alive." "Jack Morrison." Thomas recognized the voice, though it was steadier than during the last attack. Stone-cold sober this time, and more dangerous for it. "They must have been released," Margaret whispered, clutching Sarah tighter. The child was awake but silent, her dark eyes wide with fear. "Or broke out?" Thomas moved to the other window. More shadows, more movement. They were surrounded. "They're not here to take you back this time." Margaret understood immediately. Charles might have agreed to divorce, but Jack Morrison's pride had been wounded. He'd come for revenge, not retrieval. 30 seconds. Apache, Jack called. Then we light it up. Thomas's mind raced. The cabin's logs were thick, but dried by years of mountain sun. With kerosene soaking the walls, the place would go up like a torch. The root cellar was too small, would become an oven. Running meant facing armed men in the dark. Papa, Sarah's small voice cut through his thoughts. Are we going to die? No, Margaret said fiercely. No, sweetheart, we're not. She looked at Thomas. The water barrels. He nodded, understanding immediately. They kept 3 large barrels of water inside for winter use. Not enough to stop a real fire, but maybe enough to buy time. Time's up, Jack Morrison shouted. The first torch arced through the darkness, landing against the front wall. Flames immediately began licking up the kerosene-soaked logs. Another torch hit the back wall, then another on the side. The barrels, Thomas commanded. They worked with desperate efficiency. Margaret dragged one barrel to the front wall. Thomas took the back, while Sarah, brave little Sarah, used a pot to throw water on the smaller flames trying to catch near the windows. The smoke thickened quickly, making their eyes stream. The roar of flames mixed with the cruel laughter from outside. How's it feel? Apache, Jack called. Watching your little nest burn, this is what happens when savages forget their place. Thomas dumped the second barrel on a section of wall that was burning fastest, buying them moments. His mind worked furiously. They couldn't stay, but going out the door meant certain death, unless... Margaret, he said urgently. Remember the loose floorboard in the corner, the one I've been meaning to fix? Her eyes widened with understanding. Thomas had dug a shallow tunnel there years ago, paranoid preparation for attacks that never came. Until now, it led to the woodshed, 20 feet from the main cabin. It's too small for you, she protested. But not for you and Sarah. He grabbed his rifle, checking his ammunition. You go through, I'll go out the front. Draw their fire. No, Margaret grabbed his arm. We stay together or... A window shattered, flames immediately reaching through like grasping fingers. Sarah screamed, and Margaret instinctively shielded her. No time to argue, Thomas said. He kissed Margaret's forehead, then Sarah's. Go, now. Get to the woods. Sheriff Brennan will be coming. Someone will have seen the smoke. Thomas. Go. He helped pry up the floorboard, revealing the narrow tunnel. Margaret looked at him one last time, her eyes saying everything there was no time for, then pushed Sarah into the hole and followed. Thomas waited until he was sure they were through, then prepared himself. The Apache war cry that burst from his throat as he kicked open the door was the stuff of frontier nightmares, a sound that had made grown men soil themselves in the Indian Wars. He came out shooting, rolling immediately to the side. Gunfire erupted from the darkness, bullets splintering the door frame where he'd been. He fired at muzzle flashes, heard a scream of pain, kept moving. There he is, get him. Thomas used the smoke as cover, circling toward where he'd heard Jack's voice. These men expected him to run, to protect himself. They didn't expect him to attack. Meanwhile, Margaret and Sarah emerged in the woodshed, gasping and covered in dirt. Through the gaps in the walls, Margaret could see the cabin fully ablaze now, Thomas's large figure dancing in and out of view as he fought. Stay here, she told Sarah, settling the girl in the corner behind the wood pile. Don't come out, no matter what. Where are you going? Margaret grabbed the splitting axe from its place on the wall. To help your father. She slipped out into the chaos. The scene was like something from hell. The cabin roaring with flames, men shouting, gunfire cracking through the night. She saw Thomas go down, rolling behind the water trough, saw 3 men advancing on his position. Without thinking, she moved. The first man never saw her coming. the axe handle catching him behind the knee. He went down screaming, and she grabbed his gun, remembering the lessons Thomas had given her. "Behind you!" she screamed, and Thomas turned just in time to avoid a bullet meant for his back. His return fire was more accurate. They fought back to back now, smoke and shadows their allies. Margaret had never held a gun in anger before, but she found her hand steady, her aim true. These men had come to burn them alive. They'd threatened her child. There was no mercy in her. "Where's Morrison's whore?" someone shouted. "Find the woman." "Right here," Margaret snarled, her shot taking the speaker in the shoulder. But they were still outnumbered, and the ammunition wouldn't last forever. The heat from the burning cabin was intense, driving them further back. Soon they'd be in the open, easy targets. That's when they heard it. Horses, lots of them, and Sheriff Brennan's voice roaring, "Stand down, everyone, stand down, or we'll cut you down where you stand." The cavalry had arrived. Literally, not just Brennan and his deputies, but a squad of actual Army soldiers from Fort Grant, drawn by the smoke and flames visible for miles. "Drop your weapons," the Army captain commanded. "This is military territory now." The remaining attackers, seeing uniformed soldiers with rifles trained on them, quickly complied. Jack Morrison tried to run, but didn't make it 3 steps before a deputy tackled him. "Thomas Margaret," Brennan called, squinting through the smoke. "You alive in there?" "We're here," Thomas called back, lowering his rifle but not releasing it. "Sarah's safe." As the soldiers rounded up the attackers, Margaret ran to the woodshed, returning with Sarah clutched in her arms. The child was crying now, the delayed reaction of terror and relief. They stood together, watching their home burn. Everything they'd built, everything they'd gathered to make a life, all turning to ash and ember. Margaret felt tears running down her soot-stained cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This is my fault. If I hadn't come here—" "Then I'd still be half alive." Thomas interrupted firmly. "Sarah would still be growing up without a mother's love. We'd have a cabin, but not a home." Sheriff Brennan approached, his face grim. "Jack Morrison and 4 others dead. 2 captured. This wasn't just about revenge. Thomas, we found dynamite in their saddlebags. They meant to kill you all and make it look like an accident." "Will it stick this time?" Margaret asked wearily. "Or will they be out again in a week?" "Oh, it'll stick," the Army captain said, joining them. "Attacking civilians on what's technically military patrol territory. That's federal jurisdiction. These boys are looking at hard time in Yuma, if not the rope." As dawn broke over the mountains, the full devastation became clear. The cabin was a total loss, only the stone chimney still standing like a gravestone. Their possessions, their food stores, Thomas's tools, all gone. "What will we do?" Sarah asked in a small voice. Thomas knelt beside her, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders. "We rebuild," he said simply. "The Apache have been burned out before. We always rebuild." "The whole town will know by noon," Margaret said quietly. "They'll say this proves they were right about me bringing trouble." "Let them," Thomas replied. "We know the truth." Sheriff Brennan cleared his throat. "Actually, about that, Mrs. Garrett from the boarding house sent word. She's offering you rooms, free of charge, while you rebuild, and the pastor, not Henderson, the young one from the Mexican church. He's organizing a barn raising. Seems burning out families doesn't sit well with everyone." Margaret stared at him, stunned. "But why?" "Because," Brennan said with a slight smile, "courage has a way of inspiring folks. You 2 fought off 7 armed men, protected your child. Some people are starting to think maybe they've been backing the wrong horse." As the morning sun climbed higher, warming their smoke-stained faces, neighbors began arriving. The trader Jameson with a wagon of supplies, Mrs. Garrett herself with blankets and food. Even some of the townspeople who'd shunned them came. shamefaced but willing to help. "Look, Papa," Sarah said wonderingly. "All these people came for us." "No, sweetheart," Margaret corrected gently, watching Thomas accept a handshake from a man who'd spit at his feet a month ago. "They came for what's right. Sometimes it just takes a fire to show people what's worth saving." Thomas pulled his family close, his daughter, his soon-to-be wife, his whole world. Behind them, their home smoldered in ruins. Ahead, the community that had rejected them was slowly, carefully, extending its hand. "We'll build it better this time," he promised. "Stronger, with stone foundations and proper defenses. And bigger windows." Sarah added, "Miss Margaret likes sunlight." "And a real bedroom for Sarah," Margaret said, smiling through her tears. "With space for all her rock collections." They stood there planning their future home while the ashes of the old one still smoked, surrounded by people who'd finally seen past prejudice to the family underneath. The fire had meant to destroy them. Instead, it had forged them stronger and revealed allies in unexpected places. Jack Morrison had been right about one thing. This was what happened when people forgot their place. But he'd been wrong about what their place was. It wasn't at the margins, wasn't in the shadows of shame and fear. It was here, in the light of a new day, building something better from the ashes of the old. The sun rose over the mountains 6 months later, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Margaret stood in the doorway of their new cabin, stronger and more beautiful than the one that had burned. The community had come together to build it, stone foundation as Thomas had promised. Thick walls chinked tight against winter winds. And yes, bigger windows that caught the morning light just as Sarah had requested. "It's perfect," Margaret murmured, running her hand along the smooth wood of the doorframe. "It's home," Thomas corrected, coming up behind her with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one, and they stood together watching the sunrise. "Ready for today?" Margaret nodded, though her hand trembled slightly as she raised the cup to her lips. Today was her wedding day. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago. Charles Morrison's signature shaky from drink but legal nonetheless. He'd died 2 weeks later. They'd heard, alone in his grand house, his liver finally giving out from years of whiskey and rage. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The ceremony would be simple, just them. Sarah, Sheriff Brennan to officiate, and a few friends who'd stood by them through everything. Mrs. Garrett had insisted on baking a cake, and young Pastor Martinez from the Mexican church would give a blessing, though the legal ceremony would be civil. Margaret had no desire to stand before the town's main church, not after Mrs. Henderson's venom. "Miss Margaret," Sarah came running from the chicken coop, eggs gathered carefully in her apron. "Look, Bonnie gave us 6 eggs today. She must know it's special." Margaret laughed, setting down her coffee to help the child with her burden. Sarah had grown 2 inches in the months since the fire, was learning to read and write with Margaret's patient teaching, and had developed a confidence that made Thomas's heart swell with pride. "We'll make something wonderful with these," Margaret promised. "Your papa's favorite breakfast." "Our papa," Sarah corrected with a grin. "After today, he's officially our papa, right?" Margaret's eyes misted. "That's right, sweetheart. We'll be a real family in the eyes of the law." "We've been a real family all along," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "The law's just catching up." As the morning progressed, their small wedding party began to arrive. Mrs. Garrett came first, arms full of wildflowers she'd gathered for Margaret's bouquet. "Prettier than any hothouse roses," she declared, arranging them with practiced hands. Mr. Jameson arrived with his fiddle, grumbling about his old fingers but secretly pleased to have been asked to provide music. Even Doc Wheeler showed up, the man who'd first treated Margaret's bruises all those months ago. "You look different," he told her quietly as she greeted guests. "Stronger, happier." "I am," Margaret said simply. Sheriff Brennan arrived last, wearing his best suit and carrying an official-looking book. "Well," he said, surveying the small gathering, "this is a far cry from the last time I had to come up here officially." "Thank goodness," Thomas replied, shaking the man's hand. He wore a new shirt Margaret had made him, his hair neatly braided with leather Sarah had decorated with beads. He looked what he was, a man of two worlds, making his own path between them. The ceremony itself was brief but profound. They stood before the stone fireplace Margaret had insisted on building extra wide. "For all the cold winters ahead," she'd said, though Thomas knew it was really for all the family gatherings she envisioned. "Do you, Thomas Blackfeather, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Brennan asked, his voice carrying surprising gentleness. "I do," Thomas said, his deep voice steady as the mountains themselves. "Do you, Margaret O'Brien, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Margaret looked up at Thomas, seeing in his dark eyes all the promises spoken and unspoken, protection without possession, partnership without domination, love without conditions. "I do," she whispered, then stronger. "I do." "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife." Brennan grinned. "Thomas, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, respectful of their audience, but full of promise. Sarah cheered and threw the handful of flower petals she'd been clutching, making everyone laugh. As they turned to face their friends as husband and wife, Margaret noticed movement on the trail below, riders approaching. Her heart clenched with automatic fear until she recognized them. It was the young woman from the Morrison house, the servant who'd whispered support that day at the trading post, accompanied by two other women Margaret vaguely recognized from town. "Begging your pardon," the young woman said, breathless from the climb. "We heard it was your wedding day. We brought something." She held out a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a quilt, beautifully made with intricate stitching. Margaret recognized the patterned wedding rings interlocking, a traditional design for new brides. "We've been working on it since the fire," one of the other women explained shyly. "Those of us who understood why you had to leave. There's more of us than you might think. Mrs. Mrs. O'Brien. Mrs. Blackfeather," Margaret said softly, the name feeling right on her tongue. "And thank you. I don't have words." The women stayed for cake and dancing, their presence a benediction Margaret hadn't expected. As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived. Not many, but enough. The young pastor and his wife, a few of the Mexican families from the valley who'd always treated Thomas with respect, even cranky old Sam from the mine, who'd lost his own daughter to a brutal husband years ago. As the sun began to sink toward evening, the guests gradually departed, leaving the new family alone. They sat on the porch Thomas had built wide enough for sitting and watching sunsets. Sarah sprawled between them with her head in Margaret's lap. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked quietly. Margaret considered the question. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman running into a blizzard, preferring death to the life she was fleeing. She'd been broken in ways she thought couldn't heal, carrying shame that wasn't hers to bear, believing the lies told about her worth. Now she sat with a husband who saw her as an equal, a daughter who loved her fiercely, in a home built by community from the ashes of violence. The town hadn't fully accepted them, might never fully accept them. There would always be those who saw her as the fallen woman, Thomas as the savage, Sarah as the half-breed. But there were also those who'd learned to see past the labels, who'd watched them fight for each other, build together, love without reservation, who'd finally understood that sometimes the rules society made were wrong, and the people who broke them were right. "Yes," she said finally, running her fingers through Sarah's hair. "I'm happy, happier than I ever dreamed I could be." "Good," Sarah murmured sleepily. "Because you're staying forever. Remember I asked Papa the first night, and he said yes." Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances over the child's head, remembering that night of storm and desperation that had brought them together. "Forever's a long time," Margaret said softly. "Good thing we've got a strong house now," Thomas replied, pulling them both closer. "Built to last." As darkness fell over the mountains, they moved inside their solid home. Margaret lit the lamp she'd placed in those bigger windows, sending warm light spilling out into the night. Anyone passing on the trail below would see it and know that here lived a family. Unconventional, perhaps. Forged in crisis, certainly, but unshakably together. The fire that had tried to destroy them had instead refined them, burning away everything that wasn't essential, leaving only what mattered: love, loyalty, and the choice to build something better from the ashes. Sarah was already asleep in Thomas's arms as he carried her to her new room, a real room of her own, with shelves for her rock collection and drawings on the walls. Margaret followed, pausing to blow out candles and bank the fire, small domestic acts that filled her with quiet joy. "No regrets?" Thomas asked as they prepared for bed in their own room, another luxury of the new cabin. "None," Margaret said firmly. "Not one." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. But inside, the Blackfeather family was warm and safe, bound together by choice and strengthened by trial. In the morning, there would be chores and challenges, the ongoing work of building a life on the margins of a society that didn't quite know what to do with them. But tonight, there was peace and love, and the quiet satisfaction of a journey completed. Margaret Blackfeather, for that was who she was now and would always be, closed her eyes and smiled. She had been hired for one night as a cook. She had stayed forever as family. And in between those 2 points lay a story of transformation that proved sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as the fiercest storms. The mountains stood eternal guard around them, and in their shelter, 3 souls who'd found each other in the darkness rested safe in the light they'd kindled together. Home at last. Home forever. Home. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, courage, and redemption in the Wild West. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of frontier life. And let me know your thoughts about Margaret and Thomas's journey. Did their story touch your heart as much as it touched mine? Share your feelings in the comments.